Welcome everyone. Great to see everyone here. My name is Luis Vieira. I'm the coordinator of the Bretton Woods project based in London, and we're one of the co-organizers of this event. I thought I would just take a brief moment to thank all the participants who are here in person, those who are online also, and of course our great panelists who will contribute to what we hope is a lively discussion on very topical and important issues. I'd like to begin by recognizing and thanking our organizers, which are Arab Watch Coalition, the Bretton Woods Project, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Christian Aid, Eurodad, the Global Development Policy Center, and LatinDad. And I'll keep my remarks extremely short because time is short. I just wanted to provide maybe a context for this discussion. As you know, we're here today in Washington, D.C., where the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF have just are in the midst of being completed today and tomorrow. And given what's a well-known, very difficult economic condition today, and looking forward from all the projections that we could see from this past week, we thought it would be an appropriate and timely and important opportunity to look at the origins of what Professor Tooze has called the poly crisis. Why are we here today? Because we strongly believe that the economic conditions that pre-existed the current crisis resulting from the war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic need to be addressed. And we think one of the foundational aspects that led to the conditions that have been exacerbated by both recent crises is precisely a lack of democratic governance structures and a governance deficit at the International Monetary Fund. So we're really here to explore these dynamics and to think collectively about what must change in order for the international community and the global population to be able to address these crises actively in a way that really benefits the most vulnerable and that supports the framework of international human rights obligations to which states, including the shareholders of the IMF, are bound. So we hope to have a very useful, engaging discussion, and we hope this is but a first step in a continued effort to modify the ossified structures of the IMF, which of course developed in when many of their shareholders still had colonies and hardly a representative structure. And we'll also address the other gap in accountability, which is not only to states but also to the communities affected by the programs and policies of the IMF. So thank you very much again. Just to say that this is being live streamed on Zoom and will be recorded as well. And we'll have a period of question and answers after the panel discussion. And we encourage those of you obviously here, but also those online to share your questions and comments on the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. My name is Victoria Guida. I'm an economics reporter at Politico, and I will be moderating our first panel here, where we're going to further set the stage. We have a great group here. Joining us online is Congressman Chuy García, who represents Illinois' 4th District and sits on the House Financial Services Committee, as well as the committees for Transportation and Infrastructure and Natural Resources. We also have online Adam Tooze, who is director of Columbia University's European Institute and author of multiple great books, including Crashed, which was on the global financial crisis. We have Andrés Arauz, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Policy and Economic Research and former General Director of Banking at the Central Bank of Ecuador. And then immediately to my left is Patricia Miranda, who is Global Advocacy Director for Economic and Social Justice, member of the C7 Steering Committee, and she was formerly Program Officer for Debt Relief International. So a great group here. We only have Congressman Garcia for a short period of time, so I want to turn to him as soon as possible. And Congressman, if you could kick us off, that would be great.
Thank you, Victoria, and good day to all. It is an honor to be here today among fellow progressives from around the world to discuss a very important but often overlooked part of U.S. foreign policy, and that is our approach to international financial institutions, or IFIs. Thank you to the host organizations for inviting me, and of course for the crucial work that they've done to improve the approach of the US and other governments to IFEs. IFEs play a key role in the international economic architecture. They claim to do so in the name of poverty reduction and sustainable economic growth, but they are also political institutions. And the policies that they promote are the product of different interests competing on uneven ground with tremendous consequences for food insecurity, migration, and economic development, and more. The US has significant power within IFEs. In Congress, I'm working to encourage the US to use that power to help IFEs meet their stated goals. IFEs have a variety of tools at their disposal to help affected countries revive growth and jobs. One critical tool is the issuance of special drawing rights, or SDRs, which help supplement the financial reserves of IMF member countries. Right after the pandemic started, I introduced the robust International Response to COVID Act to promote an issuance of SDRs because the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that it generated drove home the interconnections of global problems and their solutions. I then pushed for it everywhere I could through the amendments process in hearings and more. My bill language supporting the issuance of $2 trillion worth of SDRs passed the U.S. House of Representatives in July of 2020. In February 2021, I reintroduced the bill in the 117th Congress to push for further action. In July of 2021, that legislative language was again approved by the House. In August 2021, thanks to this pressure from Congress and from the many groups represented here today, the IMF issued the biggest allocation of SDRs in the fund's history, $650 billion worth of SDRs. The release of these assets was a tremendous success. Analysis by the Center for Economic and Policy Research found that a year later, over 100 low and middle income countries used SDRs to finance their response to the pandemic and avoid financial catastrophe, including over 90% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Since that issuance, new challenges have emerged. The price of food and fuel across the world has skyrocketed because of Russia's war on Ukraine and ongoing supply chain issues. To make matters worse, the US and other countries across the world are aggressively raising interest rates. The IMF warned just this last week that the world is headed for stormy waters as a worldwide recession becomes increasingly likely. We know from 2008 that when a global recession happens, low-income and middle-income countries are often hit the hardest. Developing countries are bracing for disaster. Countries need new SDR issuance to face these and other challenges. As we fight for new SDR allocation, progressives must also push back against the harmful IMF policies that hurt developing countries. That's why I've been fighting to end IMF surcharges. IMF surcharges get imposed on a country because it is already overburdened by debt. At the exact same time, it can least afford them. Let's take Ukraine as an example. Ukraine is one of the countries subject to surcharges, but the IMF establishes that number, estimates that number is going to rise. It is projected to pay $483 million in surcharges between 2021 and 2025. That's money that it desperately needs to defend itself, and once the war is over, to rebuild. Pakistan is another example. This summer, Devastating floods killed over 1,500 people, displaced thousands, and caused food insecurity in the country. Officials estimate they need over $10 billion to rebuild, and yet Pakistan is projected to pay more than 392 million in surcharges to the IMF between 2021 and 2025. That's money that Pakistan should spend on recovery, on building stronger infrastructure, because these floods will only become more severe as climate change gets worse. The IMF has a vested interest in keeping surcharges in place. They fund a large part of the IMF's operating costs. Countries like Ukraine and Pakistan that are already suffering should not be forced to pay surcharges that underwrite the IMF's operations costs. That's why I led a letter on surcharges with Representatives Ocasio-Cortez and Jayapal, and why I introduced the Stop Onerous Surcharges Act, which requires the U.S. IMF's representative to advocate and vote for immediate review of the surcharge policy and suspension of the policy while a review is pending. Partnership with many of you and with the support of the House Financial Services and Foreign Affairs Committees, I was able to push for the inclusion of my legislation as an amendment in the House-passed Defense Budget, or the NDAA. Senator Chris Murphy introduced this amendment on the Senate side, and we're working on a path forward to make sure the text passes Congress. Now, I've provided a brief overview of some of the work I'm doing in Congress. I'd like to end by thanking you all in your tireless work that makes my work possible in Congress, and I look forward to continuing to collaborate together to ensure that IFEs provide countries confronting crisis with the financial tools they need to achieve community-supported solutions and justice-driven development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And before you have to leave, I did want to follow up on your remarks a little bit. So you mentioned how you're fighting for some additional relief for some of these countries through the IMF. I'm just wondering, given everything that's going on domestically here in the U.S., inflation, how much focus is there on this sort of global crisis, all of the poly crisis that we're talking about here today? And does it seem like there is a critical mass to try and get more relief through Congress?
Well, that's a great question. Congress is important here to pursue these reforms because it can write letters and pass legislation that applies pressure on the Biden administration to act. But the power lies with the Treasury Department. They can, at any moment, support another issuance of the same size as last year's, and these were the largest ever. They can also use the U.S.'s powerful voice and vote at the IMF to end surcharges. Of course, members of Congress like me won't stop fighting for these things because we've seen pressure from Congress plus pressure from groups. But given all of the domestic agenda and what we're facing, it is increasingly important that over the next couple of months, we continue our effort. The economies of the world and the global financial system are so interconnected, but it's important for us to be leaders and to recognize that if we don't do things that provide relief to developing countries, then millions and millions of people will suffer.
Well, and you also mentioned the flooding in Pakistan, and previously you've talked about the use of special drawing rights for climate justice purposes. And I'm curious to what extent you see progress on that front, and whether there's a push for that, in Washington.
With all of the natural disasters that we've experienced, and very recently, both here at home and abroad in places like Pakistan, we saw all of the flooding and fires in different countries in Europe and of course in Asia as well. A new SDR issuance allows us to provide vital resources to countries like Pakistan as they deal with the devastating impacts of climate change. A new issuance, of course, is also necessary for responding to the threat, the global threat of climate change. Climate change is the greatest challenge of our time. To solve it, we need to mobilize the world. We do that by making sure that developing countries have the resources that they need to finance their own disaster resilience and to transition away from fossil fuels. Remember that Pakistan is facing these floods and still has to worry about paying incredibly high surcharges to the IMF. And that's not right. So whether it's Pakistan or Ukraine, these surcharges take a huge toll on the operations and the governments of developing countries as they face these crises. So if we have any hope of addressing climate change, we must fight for a new issuance of SDRs, eliminate the harmful surcharges, and make other critical reforms. Two IFEs, and I'm sure that the remaining panelists today will shed even more light on the urgency and importance of doing this.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Congressman.
Thank you.
I want to turn now to Adam Tooze, who has written about this poly crisis that we face ourselves, that we're faced with now globally. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about what makes this series of crises different from past crises, and what actions might be taken in the short or the long term to try and deal with them.
Well, thank you very much, and may I echo the Congressman's thanks to all of you for organising this panel and for him for giving us such an eloquent introduction to the urgent issues that face us. I don't think that the notion of a polycrisis signifies in and of itself something radically new. I think the diagnosis has been with us for about half a century, to be honest. I think the first moment at which contemporaries became aware of a crisis of the type that we currently face is probably in the 1970s. And I suggest that is, as it were, the perspective within which we organise our thinking. I don't think it's useful to go back, in other words, to the 1930s, nor, however, do I think it's useful to think of the 70s as a simple template in the manner of a lot of scaremongering about inflation, for instance. But if you're trying to think together a crisis which involves a genuine multipolarity of the global order, an unhinging of the fiat money system, the dawning awareness of ecological problems, a challenge more specifically beyond general multipolarity from the global south to the hegemony of the north, and then specific issues to do with energy, then of course the 70s do come to mind. And I think that's, in a sense, the continuity, the intellectual continuity, which allows this idea which emerges from social scientific systemic thinking about crises to kind of echo, if you like, across two generations down to our present moment and gives it the resonance that it has today. So a term I didn't invent, but was circularized by Jean-Claude Juncker in 2015 around the European crisis of the moment, and he borrowed it from the French systems theorist and theorist of complexity Edgar Morin, who belongs in that first generation of global thinkers of the environmental crisis that we face in the current moment. I do think, however, that what we're facing is a progressive escalation, a dynamization, an acceleration of the pressures that are acting on us. And if you add up the elements, it truly is a daunting complex. I mean, we have the double hit of the Anthropocene operating at two different chronologies, right? We have, on the one hand, the ongoing acceleration of climate shocks, which in mega-regional contexts now are beginning to shake energy and food systems in a very manifest way, And the World Meteorological Organization in the last 24 hours has published a report outlining how vulnerable our entire energy infrastructure is, the thermal power plants as well as the hydroelectric power plants, to shocks of this type. So on the one hand, we have, as it were, the climate crisis now arriving in earnest, and northern South Asia, the belt across northern India and Pakistan, is in absolutely the crosshairs of this, as we've seen through this fearsome oscillation between extreme heat and extreme downpour over the last 3 or 4 months. On the other hand, we have the dynamic of the Anthropocene manifesting itself in the form of zoonotic mutation and pandemics, which move not at the pace, if you like, of years and decades, but literally at the pace of days, weeks, and indeed hours at critical moments in the course of the global pandemic. And that shock operates literally globally, so across the entire world. Again, quite different so far in the crisis of the climate, which is still a mega-regional crisis on the whole, rather than being fully global. So the arrival of both of those long prophesied, long foreseen threats on, in our reality as a current moment is in and of itself, I think, a marker of our current moment. Then you have things which are more cumulative, where you might look, for instance, at the macro-financial dimensions of the current crisis, where both in the advanced economy, the emerging market, and the low-income developing world, we have, as it were, a series of events which go back to the early 2000s, which go through the 2008 crisis, the emerging market crisis of the 13-15 period, the commodity sell-off, the accumulation of debt and the shifting patterns of debt, which mean that the current debt picture is huge in scale and much more complex in terms of the sources of debt. We all know the story, the access to private markets, the mobilization of Chinese funding, which displaces the Paris Club, a whole new configuration of debt issues, which are also, both in their complexity and their scale, novel. And then I'll just add one third element to the current moment, which I think, registers on a horizon, and then we just displace it to the outside of our mind because it's just too radical, which is the outbreak of a full-on shooting hot war between major nuclear powers, or not a direct one, but a proxy war, of course, but to all intents and purposes, the outbreak of open conflict between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, and the ever more evident reality of the determination, notably on the Western side, on the US side, to uncouple key elements of the global system, global economy built in the last 30 years, insofar as China is concerned. And so these three elements, I think, by themselves would allow us really to say that we're dealing now with a polycrisis of a new order, of a new intensity, and furthermore, all of these elements interact with each other, and they show none of them any tendency to de-escalate. So, without being able in any precise way to define the ramp up and the direction of travel, this isn't economics or economic modelling we're talking about here, it's something more complex and indeterminate. It looks as though we're dealing with a situation really of mounting risk. And to just conclude, what we also know from recent experience in 2020 is that the global governance framework for dealing with these kind of risks is fragile to non-existent. We're seeing in the current moment an extraordinary, historic, and this would be you could say the fourth element, the historic exercise in fiscal and monetary tightening that we're going through right now on an entirely uncoordinated way. So in an era that we know is characterized by deep globalization, that as recently as 2020 we saw shocks rippling through the global financial system, we're nevertheless embarking on a counter-inflationary campaign in a completely nation-by-nation cavalcade led de facto, without really further discussion or negotiation by the Fed, on the basis of the power of the dollar. And I think that really kind of, for me, encapsulates the huge gap between the unprecedented global nature of these challenges and the archaic, it's another facet of this issue of the archaicism of our global financial institutions on the other.
Great, yeah, and that's a perfect segue to Andres. I wanted to ask you, we do have all of these central banks, virtually all central banks, not quite all of them, trying to fight inflation that is both global and local. So I'm curious whether you think that it's possible for central banks to coordinate more, or if the circumstances are so different across regions that at this present moment it's not really that possible.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, and thanks Adam, Tooze, and Representative Chuy García for the introductions. I think they're very important. And to answer your question right away, I'd like to question one of the premises that you say, and it's that central banks are raising interest rates to fight inflation. I come from the developing world, and to be honest, most central banks are either preempting, rising the interest rates preemptively, or rising them not really to fight inflation, but to avoid capital flight in response to the United States rise of the interest rates. This is what we have to do as developing countries. We have to, try to convince speculative capital to please do not leave, given the rise in the interest rates, and to keep their money in our countries. And we're willing to sacrifice growth, inclusion, entrepreneurship, and so on, so as long that speculative capital can remain in our countries. And that's why it's essential that we design decoupling mechanisms, or at least marginal elements of sovereignty, economic sovereignty, by trying to influence the international policy of interest rates, and of course the case of the Fed. We know that the United States government, the Federal Reserve, has repeatedly said, well, the dollar is my currency, but it's your problem. Historically, this has been an issue. But I think we do have the capacity to try to influence other instances like multilateral development banks that have a great portion of developing countries' debt, but they are tied to variable interest rates that depend ultimately on the Fed rate, right? So I think that's something that can be done with enough political will, with enough pressure from the global South, to try to say, hey, let's put a freeze or a cap on the rise of interest rates of MDB debt. Most of it is either tied to LIBOR or to the new SOFR rate. The IMF's own debt is tied to the SDR rate, which is itself tied to the rich countries' interest rates. And we have to avoid a new Volcker shock that was extremely painful to, for example, my region, Latin America, in the 80s, that basically destroyed the progressive developmental policies that were taken at one point in history. Linked to that, we have the issue of surcharges. So not only do we have rising interest rates, but countries that are in need of debt because of the crisis, the exogenous shocks, the shocks that happened before that Adam mentioned as well. Now we have rising rates, but then also surcharges based on the amount of debt, and also based on the time that has gone by since the disbursement happened. And I think that's also something that, with enough political will, we can get rid of those, and it can be some debt relief for countries. I, of course, would like to agree with Representative García on his proposal on SDRs. They are also a way of debt relief, even though it has not been completely understood as that. But this is money that didn't used to exist before, then it exists, and you can use it to get rid of previous debt. It is a way of debt relief. You can also fund governments with the SDRs, with fiscal use of the SDRs, and thus avoid incurring in new debt. So I think they are absolutely crucial in this context, not to mention the further implications that it has on the international reserve system. I think the fiscal use of SDRs also open a new discussion that has been considered basically taboo for a long time, which is the possibility of central bank treasury coordination. And I'm talking about financing as well. Why is this taboo in an era of such a great crisis, and a polycrisis? We have to think about getting rid of those taboos, or at least putting the issue again on the table and openly talk about it. And I think SDR is an opportunity to reach that way. And just coming back to my original point about the rise of interest rates in the developing world, even preemptively to avoid capital flight, there is a little article within the Articles of the Agreement of the IMF, which is Article 8.2b. I invite everybody to look into it, which was designed, proposed by both Keynes and White in 1944. And the original version said that basically, if the countries that are receiving all this capital flight that's flying away from developing countries, the receiving countries should return that capital that flew away from the developing countries, right? Of course, that was in the draft version of the Articles of Agreement. that didn't get in that way into the final text of the Articles Agreement. But if you look at the article now, it has a similar wording that says that capital that flew away from developing countries into the rich countries, if they violated the currency arrangements of the developing countries, are to be unenforceable. So there's a chance to have the possibility to return that capital flight to developing countries, and we really have not explored that option sufficiently. And it's very crucial to do so, because, for example, in the case of Ukraine, you have international reserves under the hood, the umbrella of the central bank that are around $20 to $30 billion. But if you look at their statistics on the international investment position, there are over $100 billion of private capital that belongs to Ukrainians, to rich Ukrainians, outside of the Ukraine, right? That is stashed where? Probably and most likely here. And this entire framework of opacity, offshore structures, trusts, and very sort of not transparent instruments allow for this to happen. This is also the case of Argentina, where you have small reserves, but $250 billion worth of Argentinian elites' money that is not in Argentina. That is actually an issue. In the case of Ecuador, we have $8 billion in reserves, but $30 billion of Ecuadorian elites' money that's stashed abroad, mostly in the United States and in Panama, according to some research that I did. So I think we have to really think about capital flight and that issue as a way of trying to return that money to developing countries in this context where the rising interest rates are definitely creating major issues in that regard.
Thank you. And Patricia, I wanted to turn to you. Feel free to build on anything that Andres said if you'd like to add to. But I also did want to ask, there's always this question at the IMF of how to deal with debt relief versus, trying to enforce more structural reforms to try and deal with, to try and help countries not have to go through some of these crises at a later time. And so I'm curious how you think that balance should be struck.
Thank you. Well, yes, first, thanks to the other panelists, very, very interesting and key points, and I would like to briefly address some of them. Andres was mentioning interest rates, and well, I'm from Latin America as well, and our countries, for instance, Mexico, among its highest interest rates is 12%, Colombia 10%, and if we compare with the interest rates for USA bonds, for instance, it's 2%. So besides this risk of increasing rates, some of our countries are already in a high debt, in a high level of interest rates. And after the pandemic, almost all our countries had to increase their debts to face and to finance the fiscal expenditures needed to address not only the pandemic, but now the inflation, the food crisis, and so on. I would like also to briefly mention about what Chuy García mentioned about SDRs, and actually for middle-income countries, and which is most of them in Latin America, but there are also middle-income countries in Asia and Africa. This was the only global policy that we had for our countries in a context of crisis. And particularly for those countries that could use it, you could use them for fiscal use. As Andres was mentioning, and here the relationship between central banks and ministries of finance or treasury has limitations and restrictions that are mainly applied by the same IMF. And addressing your question, we have a report that one of our recent reports on debt. And we see that the power structure of the international financial architecture has changed over not the last years. If we think of decades, it has been changing, and the IMF does not have the same hierarchy as it had before. And I would like to explain more about this. The power structure of this change in the power structure is reflected mainly in the commercial banks that if we think decades ago, the IMF was on the top, and when a country could get a deal with the IMF, then it was easier with the World Bank, and then with the commercial loans, let's say the Paris Club and then the London Club. So it was like a pyramid. But this has changed, and the IMF is not on the top of that for a very long time ago. Issues are pending from the role that the IMF has. Its function as a foreign policy arm of the United States is not helping, of course, in this role to stabilize the international economy. And well, this is also given because the United States, depending on its policies, might not be always interested to save the global stability before its own stability. So this is the role of the IMF as a lender of last resort, and now as a debt collector, was not did not have the results that expected if we think of the debt crisis back in the 80s. And the new role of the commercial banks, that before they were in the bottom of this hierarchy, have turned, because now institutions or investors are huge, are big, and they are not going to the IMF to ask them about where to invest. They are working with the credit rating agencies. So that's the main reference for them. And we can see the policies that the IMF with the G20, well, it was the G20, but of course the IMF is an important advisor for the G20. If we think of just the debt sustainability suspension initiative, or the debt suspension service initiative, or the G20 common framework, it's mainly for only one small group of creditors, which is mainly bilateral, but it's not addressing what I'm saying about the private investors that are the bondholders of sovereign bonds from many of our countries. So with this very general explanation, the IMF is not in the position to lead a debt restructuring process, a debt restructuring mechanism. That is what we need from several civil society organizations and debt movements have been pushing that this process, there is a process in place, because actually in this moment there is not a system at all.
Patricia, someone online asked you to speak a bit more loudly for the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
What is the microphone there?
Yes, very far
Okay.
from you, sorry.
Okay, no worries. And what we are pushing for is that this process takes place in the United Nations. That it's supposed to be a more democratic space where each country has one vote, and to have a process where it's independent, with no creditor as part of it, which would be, for instance, in this case, the IMF or any other creditors club, and to have a fair, transparent, timely, binding, and a comprehensive debt restructuring mechanism. There are other institutions, for instance, UNCTAD, that do have tools to contribute to countries where they could make their own analysis, their own debt sustainability analysis, for instance, skipping probably from these over-optimistic projections and forecasts that the IMF usually has with the DSAs, and that end up to have more debt for countries. It's not like it's a limit, or it's a parameter to have a more responsible lending. Sometimes it promotes to increase loans and increase lending. So, as one of our colleagues from UNCTAD was saying this in these past days, if you are ill, you might want to consult another doctor, not only the IMF. So there are other organizations, other venues that, under this context, where the IMF is so far from that role for what it was created, should be taken in more seriously, from our campaigning, but also in other venues to push for this, because we are in the way to, we are already in a crisis, and we have several factors as inflation, interest rates, but what else are the global decision makers waiting for to crash and then start making policies? Thank you.
So Adam, I want to bring you back in here. I'm interested on your thoughts on what Patricia is saying in terms of whether the IMF is really the best convener and leader for this current debt crisis. And then also, I'm curious if you could speak to China. U.S. officials this week sort of called out China for not doing enough in terms of debt restructuring. How large of a problem are they in this, and is there anything to be done there?
Well, I think the two problems are linked by China in that we really are dealing with a gear shift in global affairs. I completely agree that there is a sort of disconnect here, because surely along with the IMF, the other group we need to look at is the Paris Club, which was a group of largely Western, essentially G7 lenders that convened and that dominated global debt restructuring debates through the early 2000s and the large debt cut that was implemented then. And that leaves us, I think, essentially without a forum currently that adequately reflects the balance of global lending, especially in the wake of the Chinese One Belt, One Road push, which transformed the lending agenda in the last 10 years. Now, of course, largely ended. I mean, there's been something akin to a sudden stop in Chinese lending. So I think the short answer to the question of whether the IMF or any existing body is really suitable to the task of brokering restructuring, the answer is no. It's not, because it doesn't really reflect who the lenders are. It's not because nobody that we have right now really has the power, and it would need to be empowered by, because crucially, the UK and US jurisdictions, so as to enable the legal subterfuge, the legal tactics of private creditors to be contained. And we would need an entire new mechanism which also represented far more adequately the vast majority of the world's population, which is not on the creditor but is on the debtor side. And there is no matrix really, even no organisation right now which does that. So I think the short answer to that question is no. China is pivotal. It varies from case to case. I mean, Sri Lanka and Zambia are, for instance, very different cases of lending, varies dramatically across the world. One shouldn't generalize about Chinese lending. It's in fact quite focused on cases where they, I think, thought there was geopolitical advantage, where there was urgent need, or where they had raw material interests. Nor, I think, should one take at face value the highly politicized conversation about debt imperialism that was kicked off essentially and non-coincidentally by Indian think tanks around about 2017. So for me, as a critical historian, first of all, on China, the crucial thing is, do the accounts pass the sniff test of just evidence bias? And then we really need to get into the details. And the problem, of course, is the Chinese are highly opaque and themselves extremely tactical in the way in which they address their debt relief efforts. There's no doubt, I think, at this point, that behind the scenes, under the radar, the Chinese have been engaged in a gigantic restructuring program. Not just starting now, but starting probably 5 or 6 years ago, when the first collapse in commodity prices took place. And the Chinese have tipped tens of millions of dollars either into debt reprofiling or short-term liquidity support, which has come more and more to the fore apparently in the Chinese lending portfolio. But it's very difficult to arbitrate this, because in China you're dealing not only with a giant actor and a highly sophisticated one, but also one that's extremely opaque and absolutely, even if you don't go down the route of saying the Chinese are the ultimate debt imperialists, they're clearly a tactical or indeed strategic player. And so, again, this just confirms the fact that we have no real basis on which to arbitrate the range of conflicts and interests and positions. And I thought the point about, as it were, the needing to invoke many different doctors, I don't think there's any real alternative to that, but to try and aggregate, as far as we can, the variety of different perspectives and convene them. But exactly, especially in the current situation, given the geopolitics of the world in the current moment, what circumstances, as it were, bring that kind of coalition together, I don't know. It seems, and this is the really tragic situation, right? If you compare Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Egypt, for instance, all of which could be in the crosshairs of crisis, that in a sense your best bet as a debtor is to in fact be entangled in as many geopolitical crosshairs as you possibly can, because then you become too big to fail, and you can count at least on the interest of global creditors. Whether the same thing applies to a Zambia, I don't know. And that I think, is a sign of the times. It's a pretty bad indication of our mess when your best play as a vulnerable, low-income or emerging market debtor is to, as it were, put yourself in harm's way from a geopolitical point of view, because that assures you of the interest of the maximum number of global players who may also have deep pockets. I mean, it's a strategy it's extremely precarious, and it essentially implies, very, very high stakes gambles on geopolitical alignment. But I think that's the kind of world that we're in currently.
So I do want to turn shortly to the audience, both here and online, so think about what questions you might want to ask. But before we do that, I wanted to bring in Andreas, if you want to respond to this lively discussion we had.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I do think that the forum is important. There needs to be an honest conversation in the world regarding the debt situation, but not just about the juncture of this new debt crisis that's going to explode anytime now. We really need a new financial architecture that respects and understands that we are now in the 21st century, that it doesn't have to respond to the colonial era of 1944, that has a climate crisis going on, that has updated in terms of the economic paradigm of the economic science, if you want to call it that as well. And I think that needs to happen soon. Now, it won't happen just because we have the right ideas or the good intentions of powers that be. It will happen if there is enough collective action, and in this case specifically from the countries of the global south. So I think we need to organize collective action. You have mentioned the Paris Club, the London Club, we've mentioned cross-conditionalities between the multilateral development banks, we've mentioned the role that these large creditors are organized into clubs. They're organized into cartels, you can call them as well. Yeah, and we need a debtors club, right? Like the Cartagena Club of the 1980s in Latin America that was disbanded as an act of foreign policy. We need to design new coordination mechanisms of debtor countries where not only do we share experiences and analyze our cash flow requirements and compare, our clauses of the contracts that we sign, but where we can take collective action that will motivate a worldwide conference on debt, like what happened in 1953, that allowed for most of the German foreign debt to be wiped off, that helped the European continent recover after the Second World War. So we definitely need to do that, and I agree with Patricia, that it has to be at the United Nations, a neutral forum, a democratic forum where we can be more open about the true needs of our society, especially from the perspective of developing countries. And just to add an element on China, I think it's important that China is also on the table, and the UN is also a space for that to happen. But we really have to consider that we are not exaggerating the role of politicizing that issue, considering that it is basically applying the same practices. And in fact, according to my own experience, I was part of the debt commission in Ecuador that authorized debt contracts, including with Chinese banks. They basically use the entire Anglo-American legal infrastructure for their loans, right? So the lawyers of the Chinese banks that sign the contracts with the developing countries are either, magic circle firms in the UK or K Street law firms here in DC and New York and so on. So I think the issue is a bit more complex, and we have to probably put all those issues on the table.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, if I may say, that's an amazing insight into the way in which Caterina Pistor's argument about law operates, that the Chinese should bolt themselves into that apparatus. Sorry, I couldn't help interrupting. That's an incredible point.
Yeah, I should ask Patricia if you wanted to say anything else in response.
Yes, well, first I fully agree with, we need a new financial architecture. And if we would be successful on solving the debt problem, which is a huge problem, but anyway, it's not fully enough for our countries. Our countries need to collect fairly taxes at national and international levels. So we need a new, from a global perspective, from a holistic perspective, a new financial architecture. And on China, well, China is, I don't know, in all conversations, especially during this whole week, and in terms of debt, if we think about the whole portfolio of debt in developing countries, in some countries China is an important bilateral creditor, yes, but not in all countries. Probably we talk about Sri Lanka and some of the hot cases now, it is an important thing to discuss. But if we are talking about the whole picture of the debt portfolio in this path to resolve the debt crisis, it's not only China. There are multilateral creditors as well. So we need to talk about them all on the table and not just China. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do want to open it up to the room now. Looks like we got a question back here.
You might or I shall.
Oh, do we
If
have
you can just stand up, it should be fine.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
And introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Matthew Behonen from the Financial Transparency Coalition. It's a question to the panel about the UN is about to decide on a date for the Financing for Development conference, the 4th FFD conference. They have a resolution that's in draft. Does the panelists support that, and do you think that that could be a way to reform some of the global financial architecture? Because it had a big fight over the tax architecture in Addis 2015 the last time. It wasn't that far from being to the favor of developing countries. And what fights do you foresee in an FFD4 if you can project that far yourself? It may happen in 2024 if there's a host country and if there's a UN resolution on it. Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to take that one?
Well, we all have expectations of a next conference, the next FFD4, and I think it's a double-sided thing. It is an opportunity to push for the deep changes that we want, that we're pushing for so many years. Also, it's an opportunity to have an assessment of what happened since Addis, and we are so close to the Agenda 2030. I mean, it's like 8 years, and are going to achieve the SDGs, the FFD. It's supposed to be the financing side of those ambitious SDGs. So it will be an important space for an assessment. But also, there could be risks, as what if in that space the IMF and the G20 takes the advantage to put as part of the FFD the common framework as it is. So it's also, I think, the challenge for not only CSOs, for our countries, our governments, and other stakeholders to do some damage control, that the policies that we are against of are not part of the FFD, are not part of the new policies or the new results that could be part of this important process, and that in this crisis the financing side has been the weakest. And also to have this, to close this gap and to build a solid bridge between the FFD and the Agenda 2030. So, and going a little bit back to what I was saying, if we have the right tools and the right information, we will see that if we don't have debt relief, we won't achieve the SDGs. If we don't have access to concessional financing, we won't reach the SDGs. and the IMF and the international financial institutions do have this data, and it's only for a few people, or the ones that could get into their databases and analyze. And we need to talk louder about this data, about these risks, and about what could be the challenges towards this process.
Andres or Adam, you want to add anything? Okay. We've got, let's see, let's take this one over here.
Thanks. My name is Danny Bradlow from the University of Victoria. I want to thank this panel for a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. And I want to pick up on have a comment more than a question. I want to pick up on something that Patricia said about the role of the IMF in the hierarchy of international governance. And I agree totally, we need a new international financial architecture and governance arrangement. But I think we need to recognize we have one already. In the 1980s, when the debt crisis happened, the IMF had the resources that it could essentially drive deals through for Mexico, for Latin American and Eastern European countries. The banking regulators, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, could force the banks to go along with that. Today, none of that is true. That we're living in a world where the only power really that exists is central banks, and particularly the US Federal Reserve. If you look at during the pandemic, the IMF managed to muster over a couple of years $100 billion for 80 countries. The Federal Reserve in a couple of weeks pumped trillions into the system. So we're living in a world where the international financial architecture is really governed by central banks. And it seems to me the challenge for all of us is how do we make central banks more accountable than they are now? Because even US citizens who want to hold the Federal Reserve accountable for its decisions can't do it, let alone the rest of us who don't live in the US. And I think, I welcome your thoughts on that, but it seems to me that's our challenge at the moment.
Andres, I don't know if you want to
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I agree. Central banks are, in theory, in control. Most of them are captured by financial capital. It's very few central banks in the world that you will have in the leadership positions people with actual public goals and publicly assigned and publicly committed ideas. Unfortunately, the influence of basically largest mega banks are there, and you can analyze this with all kinds of indicators, including regulatory capture, revolving doors, and so forth. But the essence is that we have to democratize central banks. And I think we have a small crack in the system that I don't want to say too loudly because they might notice, is the fact that now the world is discussing CBDC, central bank digital currencies. Now that's an entire other discussion that we can have some other time, but I just want to highlight one element. And it is the fact that if you do have CBDCs, ordinary people on the street will start to interact with this previously, abstract, faraway institution called the central bank. And there is a higher possibility of converting the day-to-day discussion of a CBDC to a more political discussion of the role of central banks in the society and the economic system in general. So I think that's a longer term but more strategic discussion that has to take place.
If I may, this issue I think is strategic, and I broadly speaking of course agree with the agenda of both politicizing and democratizing monetary policy. But I think we have to be clear about the risks involved in a strategy of this type, and I don't say this as a sort of knee-jerk defense of technocracy. But in American politics, after all, there are two camps, or there are sort of three camps. There's the centrist camp would basically prefer to allow the Fed's mandate to stay where it is and for it to do its thing. There is a left progressive camp which is demanding a more expansive, more global vision for the Fed and for US financial policy in general. And we heard from the Congressman earlier on that he belongs in that camp. And there are other forces pushing in a similar direction. But any realistic assessment of US democracy and its prospects must also, after all, allow for the fact that there's Ted Cruz out there and his ilk. And we know the damage that he did to the possibility of even just mundane, intergovernmentally agreed quota adjustment at the IMF, and the way he held the whole system hostage. So when we push for democratization and politicization of monetary policy, we should be clear that we're engaged in a double wager, an institutional wager on the one hand, and on the other, a political wager, that having, as it were, pushed for that politicization and democratization, progressive forces can actually win the argument. Because if they don't, what happens is that the monetary authorities fall into the hands of just out-and-out reactionary forces. That, you know, under President Trump, there was the prospect that gold bugs could be appointed to the Fed board. Quite realistic prospect that that could happen. We could have a tightening of, for instance, availability of swap lines to countries which the United States believed were, as it were, in one reason or whatever, and it could just be any criterion that the United States decides on. So it's the democratization agenda is one I normatively support, but I think we have to be very clear about what and this goes for the Eurozone as well in the same way. I mean, the two biggest central banks in the world where the systemically relevant central banks, the banks which control the two largest reserve assets, both of them, one could make the case for politicization and democratization, but you'd have to be pretty clear about how intense the political struggle would then need to be that followed on from that, because otherwise I fear that this is actually a proposal that would push us potentially into a more reactionary direction.
Did you want to add anything?
No.
All right. Before we turn back to the room, there is, I think, one question
Yeah,
on
there's
Zoom.
one question. This comes from Dr. Yang Wang from Boston University, and he's asking, it was the IMF and World Bank who promoted the capital account liberalization. Do you think they should be mainly responsible for rescuing the indebted countries which have capital flight?
Absolutely, yes. I mentioned the article of the agreement where I think the IMF has to take some leadership, at least in the research dimension to begin with, and then into finding the legally binding mechanisms to have that happen. One idea is a reverse FATCA agreement. You know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with FATCA, but every little bank in the world has to open a username and password account at the United States IRS to report all the accounts of U.S. citizens in any bank in the world. But the reverse doesn't happen. So when a person from a small developing country has, taken illicit financial flows and money and deposited in the U.S. account, the U.S. is not obliged to report that to the country where that money came from. So I think we do have the financial arrangements, the technology, the standards, the formats, the templates, but we still have cynicism and hypocrisy from the commanding power right now in the world. So I think that is something that can be dealt with, and I think the IMF could probably help push in that direction, as well as the institutions like the OECD and so forth. But yeah, I think in that sense as well, capital account liberalization is absolutely crucial for any talk about restructuring the global financial architecture, right? I mean, we're talking about the fact that just like you have the Paris Club, the London Club, there's also the Wolfsburg Group of the 13 largest global banks that, allow me, I call them the largest facilitators of illicit financial flows. And for every dollar that leaves a country, in terms of illicit financial flows, the consequence of that, because of basically economic accounting, will imply more debt, more external debt that countries going to be incurring in. So the issues have to be tied together as well.
All right, I think we'll go over here.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm Karim Harris, I'm a member of the Arab Watch Coalition. So first Andres, then Patricia, and Danny also talked about the financial architecture that should be changed in these years. Knowing that a lot of authors were saying since 10 years now at least that the solutions are the problem to the complex issues that we are facing in our new society. I'm talking about from the perspective of a global South citizen. I'm living in Tunisia and we are facing a big economic crisis. The problem is that if we change the architecture without changing the solutions that we can propose to such country before the architecture, it will be the same impact on the ground in Tunisia, because social issues and economic issues are merged since years now, because you can't separate even that. So should we go for a new architecture, or should we think about new solution for more complicated issues in the global south?
Patricia, you want to take that one?
Oh, I'm not sure if I understand the question. If your question is to also have policies in our countries, to have systems, and I think we need both. And to give an example around debt, for instance, and the risks with vulture funds that they have. There are colleagues that work on that. We need bylaws in creditor countries, but we also need bylaws in our countries, in our contracts, that we currently don't have, or it's at a minimum scale. So a new financial architecture needs not only those policies, but also these instruments in both sides at the same time. Probably the former director of the central bank.
Yeah, just perhaps to add that even within the current architecture, you can still find some solutions, and countries do have, if they get the political will, the support of the people to make those really difficult decisions, you could probably go forward. For example, at the World Bank, you have this institution which is very opaque, called the ICSID, right? The International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which amazingly is now turning conflicts between transnational companies and states over the regulation of energy, climate, tax, and other issues into debt, right? And then that debt is being bought by vulture funds. And who is the entity that's making all of this happen is, for example, the World Bank. And so a country may say, okay, I'm going to decide, have economic sovereignty, I'm not going to pay my debt, I'm going to nationalize natural resources, I'm going to change the unequal exchange that I'm a victim of. Okay, 5 minutes later, you get this arbitration filed against you by a transnational corporation here, right, in the World Bank. And the president of the World Bank has always been a United States citizen, almost always a former secretary of the government, and he's the person that, and it's always been a he, right, designates the final judges, the final arbitrators in those decisions. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're tied together, and if we can take collective action, again, in terms of leaving ICSID, leaving the investor-state dispute settlement system, I think we can make some headway into transforming some relations without necessarily the entire architecture being transformed.
Adam, did you want to add anything? Okay. I think we have another one over here.
Hi everyone. My name is Angelica. You can call me Angie, whatever. I recently graduated from the Libya Economics Institute of Bard College, and I agree this was a very provocative discussion. I feel very refreshed, and I do agree that we need to try to have incidents on the global, conveying the creditors that they should eliminate the debt. But I think that in addition to these conversations are necessary, we should also, debtor countries, I'm from Mexico, should have a conversation on how unilaterally we can undo the structures that feed the debtor dynamics within our countries. Because most debtor countries also have trade deficits, right? We are dependent on food, energy, and technology. So even if the debt were to be eliminated, if we do not get to work on these structures that perpetuate the debtor dynamics, we would go back to the debtor situation. So I want to ask, like Haldor in the 50s, or Marcelo Diamond talked about like dual exchange rates, or we can have parallel currencies, or I just want to ask which kind of unilateral instruments debtor countries with trade deficits could implement to undo into structures that perpetuate the creditor-debtor dynamics. Thanks so much.
Adam, you want to take that one?
Well, it's a huge issue, and I think it involves a gamble, right? I mean, I think there are huge risks on each side of this kind of policy proposal. The existing structures clearly perpetuate a kind of stop-go cycle of dependence, mobilization of international capital, followed by crisis, asynchronous shocks being delivered from the center. And so then we end up in the conversation we've been having so far, which is a conversation about how we improve the architecture such that that cycle is more stable and more equitable and delivers more sustained growth and development for the low-income borrowers. Your proposal goes in the other direction, which is to say, how could one build a structure in which that kind of dependence was not necessary and not relevant? And I think the risk there is the one that you run into essentially, you know, mounting inefficiency, and the standard arguments against import substitution will bind. And there are, after all, track records of experience with this, some positive but many negative, that, for instance, raise the question of why trade intensity between Latin American countries is as low as it is, and how that then emerges as a major obstacle to regional economic development. So I think, as it were, the choice that you're posing, it's not one that I have any simple answers for, but the way in which this conversation has gone seems to me faces us with two sorts of impasse. One is essentially raised by this question just now, the developmental impasse. Do we have a model which would, as it were, plausibly offer us a scenario in which the sort of development that you're talking about actually led to rapid economic growth? And the other one is there some sort of plausible proposal that has real political chances that, as it were, that points to the possibility of structural reform in the institutions which govern the entanglements of the developing and middle-income world with the rich country world? And unfortunately, my conclusion from both lines of discussion here is largely negative. In other words, I don't actually see strategies for sustainable development of an autonomous kind offering very much way forward, and nor do I see much political prospect, which is why I'm an analyst of polycrisis. I'm not an analyst of polycrisis with a view to offering, you know, the suggestion that there's some easy fix here, but rather the polycrisis seems to me to be a diagnosis of this impasse, which persists, and we can formulate on both sides of this world map, as it were, strategies that lead forward. But neither of them, frankly, seem realistic in the sense that, not because I think there are conceptual issues, and this was posed by the previous question as well, like, do we actually have a vision of how debt restructuring should be done? And B, what are the chances of actually building effective coalitions around them? And the way the deck is currently stacked, I think it's a bet at very long odds. The Bretton Woods order, such as it is, and we keep coming back to this, like, why is it the way it is? It emerged from World War II. I mean, amongst the advanced economies of the world in the 1920s and 30s, they couldn't get a debt structure done. The biggest default up to that point was not in Latin America, but it was the collective default of European debtors to the United States in the 1930s, which opens the door to the post-war system. And it took nothing less than a total global mobilization to create that architecture. It's not a peacetime plan. Bretton Woods was shaped in 1944, just weeks after D-Day. It's forged in the heat of total war. And none of those kind of dynamics seem present to me in the current moment. And this is, as it were, speaking, I don't come from the policy and development community, and that shapes this rather more, you know, dark vision, and perhaps also unhelpful vision. But I do not think that either of these tracks right now offer, at the large-scale level, realistic prospect. That doesn't mean that there aren't a variety of campaigns will come out about just egregious nonsense like the IMF surcharging. I mean, you should just name and shame institutions for doing that kind of policy. But the bigger visions that are on offer, I just really ask the question, where is the political muscle to come from, and what specifically and concrete is the vision actually of largely autonomous development that would, for instance, reduce those dependencies?
So, unfortunately, I think we're out of time. I could listen to you all talk about this for another hour. I agree, this was a very provocative discussion. So, hopefully, we've set the tone here for some substantive conversations for the rest of the day. We have a break now. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.